For those of you who were at the forum on Friday, I sincerely apologize that you have to listen to me again. I promise this isn't quite as long, not as many graphs, but I think it's interesting information. And I have to tell you, this last night I was telling the kids, I can't take you to school. Dad's going to take you to school in the morning because I have a presentation. And they don't even hear me, when I talk about economics. And then I said, oh, it's on homelessness. It's something I really care about. They're still not listening. And then I tell them, and then I'm part of a panel with a friend of mine, Chris Jenkins, and the owner of Zizos. And they were like, what? Really? You're going to meet him? Oh, tell him that's the coolest store in Colorado Springs. So that was kind of fun. So I think he's trying to pull up my slides here. I think I made him scramble again. Here we go. So I am going to just give you as quick an overview as I can, and I'm glad Susan said that, because when Kimberly Sherwood first said to me, could you do this? I said, well, I have a public health background, I have an econ background, but I'm not a homeless person. That's not what I've dedicated my career to. But as we know, it's a very complicated issue, and if you look at it from a lot of different angles, you understand it a little bit better. So, a lot of you are experts, so I'll go through these facts, these homelessness facts first. Then I'll talk a little bit about healthcare in the US, which is something that I do know something about, some economic factors, particularly local, and then just a few best practices, because I was always taught you never put a problem out there without offering at least a few solutions, just as a general guideline, very humbly, from my opinion. So the U.S. spends less on cash transfers on assistance to the needy than 26 other developed nations. This includes transfer payments like unemployment assistance and Social Security. And for this reason, we have over 500,000 homeless people in the United States. And just like public health and looking at the uninsured, these numbers are very likely understated. 1/4 of the homeless people in the United States are children. Almost 10% of the homeless are veterans, and mental health is clearly much more of an issue for obvious reasons, a lot of PTSD. And more than 90%, this one was shocking to me, more than 90% of the homeless women are victims of severe physical or sexual abuse, and escaping that abuse is the leading cause of why they're homeless. So that's incredible from a gender perspective. The rise in homelessness in America over the past 20 to 25 years, studies have shown it's largely attributable to a growing shortage of affordable housing, which we've heard about, and a simultaneous increase in poverty. And then healthcare is also a major factor, and the increasing rate of healthcare costs. Affordable housing, just a couple minutes to talk about this to set up our panel a little bit. We know that the U.S. needs at least 8 million more affordable apartments for low income, and people before me did a great job addressing this. Concomitantly, we have the decrease in the middle class. So, we're sort of setting ourselves up for this situation and exacerbating the homeless issue. This low supply means that millions of families spend more than 50% of their monthly income on rent. 5 million homes foreclosed since 2008. In fact, for El Paso County, I was looking at the data, we're now at low foreclosure rates, but when you look at all the people, from 2000, very late 2007 up until about 2 years ago, who lost their homes, many of them never got a home back, right? So even though our foreclosure rates are really good right now, comparative to, to recessionary times, we still have that issue that all of these people became homeless or had to move into low supply apartments. Lack of affordable housing, HUD budget shortages slashed budgets over 50% in recent decades, and this resulted in about the loss of 10,000 units of subsidized housing. So that's incredible. HUD is doing great things, but at the same time, cutbacks continue, right? And the cutbacks of the past are cumulative on what's going on today. Now, physical and mental health. We know that poor health is both a cause and a result of homelessness, right? Healthcare costs are the #1 reason for bankruptcy in the United States. So that's the cause part of it. And then, of course, the result is that homeless people are much less healthy. And as someone talked about earlier today, emergency care visits and so forth, just exacerbate the sort of negative cycle of high costs. Homeless people are 3 to 6 times more likely to become ill. And then cost shifting. This is something I talk a lot about when I do my healthcare presentations. Years ago, in talking about, healthcare reform and, before the Affordable Care Act was out there, I would talk with individuals who would say, I don't want to pay for somebody else's healthcare. There's no way I'm going to pay for somebody else's healthcare. I work hard. Well, guess what? You already pay for it. Back in the mid 2000s, there were some really good studies done that showed that on average, the insured person paid $1,000 more than they had to for the uninsured. Because we passed a law in 1985 that made it illegal for public hospitals to turn away, indigent people, people who couldn't afford health care, and therefore, the hospitals had to provide that care. Well, the hospitals don't do it for free. They end up cost shifting, it raises their costs, and then it gets transferred over to people who have insurance. So we're already paying for it, and it's the most inefficient type of care, right? Because a lot of times the reasons that people are in an emergency room could have been prevented. 6% of the general US population suffers from severe mental illness, but 20 to 25% of the homeless population suffers from mental illness. And that's mostly schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And that's the third largest cause of homelessness is mental health related. Self-medication, people who are in this field know that a lot of the homeless people self-medicate, and that just starts a vicious cycle, right, of substance abuse. And a lot of times that self-medication starts because of the mental health issues that they have. On average, the homeless mentally ill use about $41,000 a year in public funds for shelter, jail, hospital services. And this is dated now. So you saw the number earlier, 50-some thousand. This is from 2001. But I really liked this University of Pennsylvania study because it was over 2 years, and it was incredible because they did a sample size of 5,000 homeless people and followed them for 2 years and looked at their costs. And at that point, it was a break even. And as we shared this morning, it's actually a little less expensive to provide them with housing and support services than letting them be homeless. Homelessness is increasingly a crime in a lot of cities. Here you can see it's in 24% of US cities across the US. It's illegal to beg in public. 33% it's illegal to loiter and so forth. That, of course, is going to increase costs in terms of jail and so forth, but it's also going to perpetuate that cycle, right? Camping ban in Colorado Springs. Most of us know about this. My understanding is, and again, I'm relatively new to the community, but my understanding is that it is something that happens pretty infrequently. Not that many tickets are issued, and we do have good support services here, but it is about getting to that next level and the continuum of care. Survey by Pikes Peak United Way showed that about 1,200 people were homeless on the night of January 26, 2015. About 270 of them had no shelter. But interestingly, again, this goes back to the undercounting. The school districts did a tally as well, and they found a much higher number. So, a lot of the information that we have is shocking in and of itself, but if you actually look at it more carefully, it's probably undercounted. Chronically homeless are about a quarter of the total homeless here in El Paso County. City needs more than 18,400 units to meet its affordable housing shortfall this year, and that figure is expected to grow by about 8% in 5 years. That's a lot of units, needless to say. In 2009, before the sort of brunt of the recession, the city allocated nearly $550,000 for housing services, with more than $400,000 going to competitive grants. But these two have decreased by 50 and 65%. I wish the mayor were here but it's about accurate, Amy is saying. So that speaks in and of itself. Again, we're dealing with remnants of the recession, even though things are better now. Now, a little bit about healthcare expenditures. We spend more on healthcare, about 17.5% of our GDP, than we do on education at 5.4%, and then we do on the military at 4.7%. So, part of the reason I talk about this is not just because I know something about it, but when you look at that amount, and as was mentioned earlier in Barbara's presentation, it's very inefficient. We don't even have the best outcomes, and we have a really high incarceration rate, and we have a homelessness issue. So a lot of it is asking the question, how can we be more efficient with this $3.1 trillion that we spend in healthcare? on average, and that was 2014. So the opportunity cost, right? You spend 3.1 trillion on something like healthcare, which all of us agree is very important, but there's an opportunity cost, right? Doesn't that mean we spend less on education? Doesn't that mean we spend less on issues like homelessness? So that sort of trade-off is really important to think about. Here you can just see sort of this logarithmic increase. In 1960, we spent about 5% of our GDP on healthcare, and in 2014, it was the 17.5%, and this is per person. So we're at roughly $9,000 per person for healthcare in the US. If you compare us to a whole bunch of countries that are down there, most of these are OECD nations, you can see that the US spends over 2.5 times the OECD average in healthcare costs. Now, this is interesting because you can see here, if you plot on the bottom axis, the x-axis, total expenditures on healthcare, and on the y-axis, the outcomes, you can see that there is a linear relationship, right? Most of the time, the more you spend on healthcare, the better your outcomes. But look at where the US is. We're way out there spending, and this is dated, this is from Mary Meeker, like I think about 10, 15 years ago, more than $7,000, and yet our outcomes are lower on the scale. So that is also telling you something about the inefficiency. And then if you pull this data and make it 2013, you can see that we are still at actually beyond sort of the flat of the curve. We're not even in this realm anymore. And that's for a host of different reasons. And people say, well, is it the infection rate at hospitals? What is it? A lot of it has to do, it's almost all due to the bifurcation between the rich and the poor. The people who are the unhealthiest here are the people who are either homeless or very low income. And that is sort of an obvious correlation and sort of an uncomfortable one, but it's the reality, and most healthcare people do know that. Now, confounding factors. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just to let you know, if you look at a couple, even just a couple of the major healthcare indicators, you can see infant mortality rate as an example. Again, compared to all these other countries, we are at a much higher rate. And the vast majority of the babies who die are the ones from low-income households. Violence. I believe it was Matt who said earlier, this traumatic environment, even if you have the greatest interventions in the world for a kid, if they're going back into a very violent community, it's very hard to overcome some of those issues. So this is pretty shocking. And those were deaths per thousand. So now let's talk a little bit about the economic context. Here, decline in the middle class. Finally things are better after the recession and everything, and I shared this actually last week. But in 1979, we had about 57% of the US population defined as middle class, and then now we're down to about 45%. So that goes to show you that we do indeed have a smaller proportion of people who have livable wages. What about El Paso County? You can see here, US is the black line, Colorado is above it, and El Paso County is below it. El Paso County is at 86% of the Colorado average and 91% of the US. So, most of us in this room do quite well, but we are a bit below the US average, which means, of course, for the people who are marginalized in our society, it's more of an issue. Here is just a comparison between El Paso County and Colorado over many years, from 2001 to 2014. We're the blue bar, so you can see we are still at a lower average weekly wage than the rest of Colorado. Now, lastly, I just want to say, there are many, many good practices out there. And again, this is very sort of humble coming from me. But some of these things resonated with me, especially from coming from a healthcare background. So, for instance, Albuquerque had a Heading Home initiative where they jointly funded, through municipal tax revenue, private donations and community organizations. So, public and private partnerships. If you look across best practices in the United States, that's a key thing. The initiative helped save the city about $12,800 per program participant by reducing their need for the ER visits, the shelter, and the social services. And they had almost a 30% reduction in homelessness in 3 years. And one of the key things I pulled from this one was the public-private, but also the coordination of all of these different initiatives within Albuquerque. And that's part of what I was interested in learning here with this continuum of care in our community. Phoenix has this Veterans H3 program, and this focuses on veterans. So regardless of what their mental state or substance abuse issues may be, the program is open to all veterans. Housing is the first and core intervention because they found that once the housing was in place, all of the other interventions actually started to work. They assigned a navigator to each homeless person. And this one resonated with me because, for instance, in healthcare, anytime you have a case manager, for whether it's cancer, whether it's someone you're pulling off the streets and dealing with their health issues, once that person or that family has one individual who is helping them navigate the system, you get much, much better sort of return on your investment for any type of homeless intervention. And in Phoenix, they had a 31% reduction in the homeless population from 2007 to 2013, which to me is pretty incredible. Those were tough recessionary years. And then Salt Lake City, they have something called Housing First program, which was a state-run program. The chronically homeless are given a housing and social worker, like a coordinator, again, same theme. And they had this vulnerability index, which determines who needs help the most. This sort of reminded me of the Canadian system, having lived in Canada, where everyone thinks, oh, you have to wait and wait and wait for care, and it has its issues. But I can also tell you that they have a very sophisticated system for saying this person is acute. This person needs to have this operation tomorrow. This one can wait for next week. This one can actually wait 6 months. And they have something similar in this intervention. And this particular one had a 22% reduction in homelessness since 2005. So that's just my brief overview, and I'll hand it back over to Susan.
We're just going to have a few questions for our panelists, and I'd like to start with you, Mark. Mark, can you tell us, just from your personal experience, have you or anyone close to you experienced homelessness at some point? And how do you, just as a citizen in our community, how do you become informed about this issue, and how have you learned about this issue?
Okay, so I have worked at the shop I now own since I was 13 years old. So I have worked downtown here since 1980. My family fell apart when I was 16. I was then out on my own. And I suppose I had regular housing by the time I was 17, but I couch surfed for a year as a teenager. And then, I bought my shop in 93. In 1992, I spent that summer on the West Coast street performing, living off of my bicycle with a tent and a sleeping bag. I had plenty of money in my pocket. I made very good money, but I stayed in the state campgrounds, and I showered in the solar showers. So that was also a system used by the homeless, by the chronically homeless, and so you could only stay in one campground for a night, so they could keep them moving. So I actually stayed with homeless people every night I stayed outside, I think, 100 nights in a row, something close to that. If anyone has questions about the trip, I'll talk to them about that later. So I'm pretty familiar, I think, with a lot of ways with the homeless, and then I regularly come to work in the morning, and I have to get homeless people to move so I can open up my back door. It has a big sliding steel door. And I have to get homeless people to move. My children see this. It's a part of what we deal with near daily downtown here.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes.
Chris, can you tell us why you decided to get involved with being part of the solution, and why is addressing housing so central to the economic vitality of our community?
Well, my family's been in the Pikes Peak region for over 100 years, and so in the work that we get to do, we build neighborhoods, we build buildings, but when you do it for a while, you realize that we're really part of building a community, and so I really feel like we're called to do this. There are so many fantastic organizations, and many of them are represented here, who are trying to coalesce around helping this, but I often feel like there is a gap between the business sector and the nonprofit sector in that. So we felt like we are definitely better together and connected together through secular and non-secular groups. And so we wanted to be a part of the solution to be able to bring some housing to those that are least served in our community, because we just can't build housing for those who can easily afford it, and have the market expect to take care of it. You saw very clearly from Dr. Bailey's analysis that this is a system that is broken. And so for people, our family, our company who only works in the Pikes Peak region, to not be a part of serving this sector of our population too was really not a choice. So I feel like we were called to be a part of this, and I know this isn't a panel on the project that we're working on with Springs Rescue Mission and Greshio Housing, but we're very excited about the opportunity to bring, for a start, 65 units of permanent supportive housing to our community in the very near future. And by doing that, hopefully that becomes the wave of getting more and more of this housing coming. 65 units only puts a tiny dent into 18,400 units that we're short on affordable housing, but on the chronic homeless side, it really is actually a dent in that point in time survey that United Way did about the a little more than 1,100 chronic homeless that was identified in that one. So we're excited to be here. I'm so impressed with the turnout. I thought we were doing a little discussion panel, and here we all mic'd up, and so this is great. Thank you for having us.
A question for both you, Mark and Chris, because you're both downtown business people, both the small business right on Tejon Street and then certainly having large office buildings. So what do you see in terms of the impact of homelessness in our city center? And have you seen, you've both been downtown a long time, have you seen changes in that through the years, the good, the bad, and the challenges?
Well, I am actually pretty optimistic, and I'm probably at odds with a lot of my peers. I think we have much less than we've had since the thick of the recession. But in thinning that out, what we're left with are the chronically homeless, the worst of the mentally ill, the worst of the chemical addiction. So in a sense, as you walk around, because it is the ones we're seeing are so severe, I think it can be a perception that it's worse. But I think we don't see tents around, there aren't the tent cities. It was severe, I think, 5 years ago. So in a sense, I think it's getting better, but it's getting better defined also. And so I think it is getting better. It's my general opinion. But I would say a lot of my fellow merchants would disagree with me.
You touched on something that I think is really important, and all of you probably are well more versed in this than I, but I get frustrated when vagrancy is lumped into the definition of what homelessness is. And so learning a bit about what the continuum of care is that homelessness is so much bigger than what we see as the brand of vagrancy, of what vagrancy brands it as. And that vagrancy is what Mark alluded to. I don't know that I think it's getting better. I think it does come in waves. I know that that our state is dealing with this a bit differently because of the legalization of marijuana, and that we're attracting a lot younger folks that are living on the street. And I know Susan has witnessed this too and has spoken about it, and we're trying to figure out ways that we might adapt to that. But I wish we could expand the conversation on this vagrancy issue and definitely not have it cast a negative light on the homeless conversation, because it is just a piece of what's going on in our city, just like every other city. I think we need to love our city, everybody more, but by doing that, we also need to have, we cannot have rights trump other people's rights and have it become something where our sidewalks are not comfortable for my 7-year-old goddaughter to walk down and fall into tears because somebody starts yelling at her. And so I think it's a big conversation in our community right now, and I know that we can solve it if we broaden that, and it can't be just about being firm. It also has to be about really getting this day center and the work that SRM and others are doing in our downtown to the night center, but also really getting this continuum of not housing, but continuum of care that brings the service providers so that we can educate, we can provide health care, we can provide opportunities so that this is a moment in time in most people's lives to move out. There are those that are chronic, and nobody is getting sober under a bridge or clean under a bridge. And so getting housing first and adopting that model is so important, I think, to starting to make an impact on how it affects our vagrancy on our streets.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
That's really what they both touched on, and that there's the triaging or the prioritizing of services is the same thing as the spectrum he's talking about. Is we've got the recently displaced, which we shouldn't call homeless. The person who's gone through a series of tragedies with a little bit of help that will be a slow stumble in their life. If they have children, we're looking at a multi-generational problem. We can't be doing that. We've got to look at these people, that's the low-hanging fruit. There are some super simple things we can take care of before they become a problem, because that person that becomes displaced, if they have personality disorders, those are going to become exacerbated. If they are on the edge of mental illness, it's going to surface. Any one of us in this room is going to start having issues of depression if we find ourselves sleeping outside. I mean, so if we can look at that continuum he's talking about and apply it with the concept of prioritizing that, is getting those kids off the street before this becomes a problem for the next generation. And looking at those things is just so critical, and getting them a roof over their heads.
Thank you. So for all of you, how do we as a community, the Pikes Peak region, create a more unified approach to addressing homelessness? How do we build this dialogue beyond this room to really everyone in the community so that we're really building public will around this issue?
Well, definitely keep talking and expanding the conversation. I think it has definitely picked up momentum in the last several years, and I think that that's essential to being able to come up with the right solutions to be able to act upon them. I think it's really important, as I may have mentioned, to keep the secular and non-secular working together, because we have so many mutual goals, and I think in the past sometimes we haven't been as able to come together as much as we are now. So those are a couple thoughts.
Anyone else?
I'm afraid there's an issue of selective enforcement with the police, and that they will enforce a loitering law in a neighborhood, and they don't recognize downtown as a neighborhood. And there's people that live there, there's people that things, and those laws, selective enforcement is actually unconstitutional. And they need to start looking at it. If someone's to sleep in a park or lay down in a park, I don't think that person in the neighborhood is treated the same way they are treated downtown, even though downtown is a neighborhood. And so I think there's got to be a problem with that. And then the rest of Colorado Springs needs to realize that they have public parks, that the strip between their sidewalk and the street is also a public place. What would happen if a tent was pitched there? And I think that situation would be dealt with differently there. And so I want to see a certain level of equality brought to how these things are handled.
The only thing I would say, and this is from an outsider coming in, not having been in this community very long, and I talk about it all the time, it strikes me the level of caring and collaboration in this community. You know, for an MSA, a metropolitan statistical area of 650,000 people, this community is unbelievable in the turnout, you know, people showing up for things, dedicating their time to, you know, issues that are of such importance. And it can be economic development and helping businesses, something that's very private, to, you know, this issue that is very sort of public. And, you know, all these people come together, and from my perspective, that's in place. I mean, and it's incredible here. A lot of times what you see, and again, whether it's economic development or dealing with healthcare and mental health issues for the homeless, a lot of times it's about coordinating it. It's about taking all the different pieces and figuring out who does what and how can we band together. Because all these organizations have fantastic outcomes and great intentions, but, you know, getting to that next level often just calls for the coordination so that we can get to some of the solutions that, you know, like you said, people all agree upon.
So final question for you all, if it's kind of twofold, but if you were to be talking to one of your peers later this week, be it at the university or a fellow business person, and you were talking about your participation today, and they said, well, why were you a part of that? What brought you there? What would you tell them? So that's kind of part one. And then part two would be, let's look to the near term, let's say the next 3 years or so. What do you think we can get done in the next 3 years to help really move the needle on this?
That one's hard. You guys can go first.
Well, Chris talked about it, and that there's really a dialogue happening now. I think people are talking about it becoming more, people are becoming aware of it, and I think there's some progress being made. And I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that there could be actual progress that comes out of this, what's going on in this room.
I think in the broader context of not just the homeless conversation, but as a city, there is so many things that are coalescing together. I really don't think that we have realized our potential, and that's easy for people to say, but lots of cities are on a parity with what they are and what their potentials are. We have such a gap, and I think what's really neat, not just on this topic, but also on our how do we end up with a more diverse workforce? How do we provide a workforce that's going to replace the baby boomers? We are getting older, not younger, and other cities are starting to get younger. We must change that. But those kinds of conversations around a thriving downtown, how do we connect better with the southeast, with the north, so that we aren't these burbs, but we're actually a connected city. There is a movement afoot in our leadership, in our political realm, in our healthcare realm, education realm, investment coming in our healthcare realm that's different than we've had anything in many decades, with what you've all probably heard about with Penrose Memorial and Children's. There's this conversation happening, so I'm really excited about how all those are actually working towards making Colorado Springs thrive.
So I guess I'm here partially because of my healthcare background, but also both my parents were born and raised in Bolivia, which is a very poor country. So from a very young age, I saw homelessness and extreme poverty, and it struck me growing up in Washington, D.C., that I could go into neighborhoods and see extreme poverty. And it was always shocking to me, and I couldn't, until I got older, I didn't really make the connection that, it's a very complicated issue, and it's part of the reason that I ended up studying healthcare. So, it's something I feel very passionately about, and it's tied very much to economic opportunity and economic development. In terms of 3 years down the road, Affordable Care Act, I couldn't agree more with what Barbara said. Some great, fantastic things coming out of that, particularly with the Medicaid expansion in that population that is now getting covered finally. But also a long way to go. Still a lot of things that we haven't addressed as a nation with respect to healthcare. But 3 years down the road, it'll be really nice to see, particularly for communities like ours, when we're trying to pull all these different pieces together. Are we going to be able to use that public funding, that expansion, and really integrate those dollars in the most efficient manner for the people who need it the most? Because most of the people in this room don't necessarily need it the most. We've got what we need, but translating that to the population that we need, because at the root of it all is are these people sustainable? Are they able to live a decent life and make a livable wage? So pulling those pieces together, I think, is really where we're going to hopefully be in 3 years.
I hope so too. I think we can get there. I want to thank our panelists for sharing some of their thoughts today. If we could give them a round of applause.